Hello. Welcome to the 2021 Fall Forum for UCLA's Institute of American Cultures. The Institute of American Cultures at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanukvetum, ancestors, Ahihirum, elders, and Eohimkim, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. This afternoon, scholars representing UCLA's 4 ethnic studies research centers will be interviewed by a mentor on their current research. This year's presenters include Dr. Liza Black in conversation with Dr. Shannon Speed, Dr. Jane Hong in conversation with Vice Provost David Ku, doctoral candidate Debanjan Roychoudhury, interviewed by Dr. Marcus Hunter, and Dr. Stevie Ruiz in conversation with Dr. Lara E. Gómez. Our program will conclude with a Q&A, so if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our featured speakers, please do so in the Q&A box at any time. And now I'd like to introduce the Vice Provost for UCLA's Institute of American Cultures, Dr. David Ku. Thank you and welcome everybody.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Institute of American Cultures and our Ethnic and Indigenous Studies Centers, thank you for attending our annual Fall Forum. For over 50 years, the IAC and its centers have worked with the entire campus and with our community partners, advancing research for racial and social justice. This is the second year of our virtual format, and while in some ways we miss being in person, we're also realizing that we're able to reach a wider audience and provide greater access. I want to offer a special welcome to students, UCLA alumni, to community partners and friends who are able to join us today. Each year, in addition to our Visiting Scholars Program, the IAC awards grants to UCLA graduate students and faculty members. And we had a slide circulating earlier that listed this year's recipients, or this past year's recipients. And so I would encourage current students and faculty members to check out our website for the next round of applications, which is coming up. Today, we are privileged to feature scholars affiliated with our centers and their research. And I look forward to hearing about and learning from our conversations and from the larger discussion sparked by your questions and comments. So thank you, and I will now turn it back to our moderator.
Thanks so much, Dr. David Ku. And I'm really excited to get into the presentations already. So our first session, Colorblind in Christ, Constructing a History of Asian American Evangelicals in the Post-Civil Rights Era, will feature Dr. Jane Hong, Associate Professor of History at Occidental College, interviewed by Dr. David Ku, the Vice Provost of UCLA's Institute of American Cultures. Welcome.
Thank you. Professor Hong, it's great to be with you today in terms of focusing on your research. And so I know that we don't have a whole lot of time, and so maybe you could just begin by telling us about your project and its larger significance.
Sure, I'd love to. And just first of all, let me just say thank you to Christopher, Melissa, and the other organizers, and to the IAC and the Asian American Studies Center for hosting me this year. So the project I'm working on this year, I'm writing a history of Asian American evangelicals in the post-civil rights era. And I position them at the intersection of 2 big historical developments that I would argue have changed US politics, racial and religious, over the past 50 years. And those are first, the rise of the religious right, starting in the late 1970s, which recasts evangelical as a political rather than a religious identity. And then second, the demographic transformations of the 1965 Immigration or Hart-Celler Act. And my book, it's asking how post-1965 Asian immigrants have changed US evangelical institutions and politics. And it focuses on Christian higher education, parachurch groups, church denominations, national organizations, as well as faith-based political lobbies, including those that were active in the Prop 8, the same-sex marriage debates of the early 2000s here in California. So the time frame of the project is really from the late 1960s, starting with the Asian American movement through the early 2000s. And, I'm really interested in how Asian Americans have transformed historically white evangelical groups and institutions, but I'm equally interested in the communities and institutions created by Asian Americans for Asian Americans. One example is Asian American Christian Fellowship, for example, which is a parachurch fellowship that has a fairly large presence on UCLA campus. And what I'm interested in this project is this tension and the relationship between the secular and the sacred. So how Pan-Asian and ethnic identity interacted with Christian and faith identities over the last 50 years. Mainstream kind of white evangelicals have been at the forefront of narratives about colorblind racism and kind of non-structural frameworks for understanding racism and injustice in America. But I consider how and why some Asian American evangelicals buy into a colorblind framework and the whitewashing effect of evangelicalism for some Asian Americans, but not others. I'm also interested in how Asian American evangelicals experience or negotiate the anti-Blackness of the model minority and how they experience the impact of generational differences and how religion shapes Pan-Asian and ethnic identity formations over time. In terms of why the project is significant, especially for our current moment, I mean, anyone who reads the news nowadays can see how prominently white evangelicals now feature in our political discourse and analysis. And, there is that political discourse outside the academy. And I think most recently I was reading a piece this morning about kind of how white evangelicals are really motivated by fears of a multiracial, pluralistic, increasingly non-Christian America. And this is what drives a lot of their politics. So there's that political discourse outside the academy. But within US history, there's been a whole cottage industry of historians writing about the rise of the religious right, whiteness, the role of religion and Sunbelt conservatism. But these are incredibly white histories. That struck me very much at odds with what has been happening on the ground, kind of within US churches, within Asian American and other non-white communities, which is a huge influx of non-white folks, especially Asian American and Latinx folks, into American evangelicalism. So college campus parachurch groups, some of the ones I mentioned before, AACF, Cru, InterVarsity. Churches in America today, immigrant and ethnic churches are some of the fastest growing, and in fact, some of the only segments within US Christianity that are growing, while majority white churches have been in decline for decades. And so when people talk about evangelical Christians in America, the assumption is often that these are white middle-class folks, but that's increasingly not the case. And so I wanted to interrogate this huge gap that's emerged between the rhetoric and the reality of US evangelical Christianity. And I wanted to do it historically to explain how we got here with an eye to where we go next. And so, to my knowledge, there's a lot of work that's been written by social scientists on kind of contemporary evangelicalism and folks like Janelle Wong, Russell Jung, Rebecca Kim, Sharon Kim, Jerry Park. There's a lot of folks who've been writing about Asian American Christians and evangelicals in a contemporary context. But I'm a historian, and I would argue there's a much longer and bigger history that's created or given rise to these contemporary phenomena. And that's what I'm trying to sketch in my broader book research.
Well, thank you. And I guess I'm biased in that way too, because it seems to me like, obviously we need to figure out how we got to the place that we are. And to do that, your book, I think, will be really the first full history of what you've been talking about, which is really fantastic. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but one of the things that in the past fall forums that we've asked people to do is maybe give us a sense of your own intellectual journey, and also then hopefully then we can maybe pick up later on more about your book if we have time.
Sure. I mean, the big picture is I'm the child of post-65 Korean immigrants. My parents came in 1975. So I've always been interested in race and immigration policy because they were some of the only places where I actually saw my own history, my own family reflected in the classroom. This is actually my first time formally in an ethnic studies space, apart from kind of annual Asian American Studies conferences and various meetings. I was born in Brooklyn, raised in New Jersey, and I spent my entire education being educated at East Coast schools, where ethnic studies is still a battle, even today. So I've had a lot of practice and spent basically most of my academic life trying to translate my work on Asian immigration to a majority culture audience and trying to make my work legible, trying to explain why it matters. I was trained as a diplomatic historian, and so I've long studied immigration policy and race through a trans-Pacific framework. My first book looked at the repeal of the Asian exclusion laws between World War II and 1965. And I really centered Asian and Asian American actors in that story, drawing on Philippine Indian archives as well as US archives. My second book, which I just described, it's more personal in some ways. It's also my first foray into religious history. It's also my first time doing extensive oral history. So half of my sources are textual archives, but half are interviews with Asian American faith leaders, lay persons, and others. I've done about 60 oral history interviews by this point. I'll probably do another 30 to 40 by the time I'm done with the book. Being so connected to living communities has been really amazing and life-giving. It's very different from my first book, where it was just me and a bunch of documents. It's also a challenge because I don't want to misrepresent folks or upset the folks who have been generous enough to spend hours with me, really talking about their lives. And I just, I only have a minute or so. I really just wanted to say that being at the IAC and with the Asian American Studies Center this year, even so far, it's been a welcome respite and a space of refuge for me intellectually and spiritually. As I said, I've spent basically my whole academic career in grad school, my first few years as faculty, still having to make my labor and my research legible to majority culture folks. And so being in a space where I don't necessarily have to always explain everything, or I don't have to justify kind of what I'm doing, I think has been great for me. It's also given me the space to really dive in and get to a level of nuance and sophistication that I don't always get to because when you're trying to justify what you're doing and it takes like 1/4 of the article you're writing to do it, you can't always get to the same level. You can't always kind of get into the nitty-gritty. And so I'm very grateful for this space. And I think maybe folks in other ethnic studies departments and fields can resonate with what I'm talking about here. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm just grateful for this opportunity to dive into my research and to be in a space where I don't always have to explain every single piece of what I'm doing. So thank you. And thank you, David, for your support through the process.
I'm glad that we can, it's only a few minutes here, but I know that during the Q&A that we'll be able to take up other kinds of questions around your work. And of course, you'll be with us this whole year. So that's really great that there'll be other venues in which you can share about your research and interact with others. Thank you so much for just giving us a really small sample. And now I'll turn it back over to Christopher.
Thank you both. And Dr. Hong, I was just sitting here and nodding my head and so interested in your presentation. To hear work at the intersection of religious history and ethnic studies is such a treat, and I'm excited for the Q&A portion. So thank you so much. We'll move into our second section right now. And our next section is how to get away with murder, a transnational history of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which will feature Dr. Liza Black of the Cherokee Nation, an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Indiana University, interviewed by Dr. Shannon Speed of the Chickasaw Nation and director of UCLA's American Indian Studies Center.
Hello, is Shannon here?
Sorry, technology glitches. Chukma.
Okay.
Chukma, Dr. Black.
Chukma.
It's great to be with you. We're so honored to have you with us at the center this year as you work on this really important book on this incredibly urgent issue in Indian country. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the book and about how you're approaching this as a historical and a contemporary topic.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. I really want to thank everybody for being here with us today and to really give a heartfelt thank you to UCLA for this incredible opportunity. It's a little bit awkward to be interviewed by an expert when really I'm the novice and this is my new project. but I'll do my best to answer Dr. Speed's questions. So thinking about this project as a historical topic, I should mention that all of my degrees are in history, so I'm always thinking historically. And I admit to loving traditional archives with the air conditioning and the gloves and the rules. I really enjoy all of that, and I use them in this project. But I do think a lot about the present, where often there is no traditional archive. And I also think of myself as someone who's deeply familiar with Native American and Indigenous studies, who doesn't entirely exactly identify as a historian. And although history as a discipline now embraces the non-traditional archive, historians, I think, still love and maybe even prefer written records. So as I approach the past, I embrace archives of all kinds. And in this project, I'm trying to bring these interests together in two ways. So I'm looking for the historical roots of this crisis. And I'm especially looking at historical causes in legislation, meaning in federal policy for tribal nations and in policies around land theft. So the reason being that I want to understand how American law treats violence between white Americans and tribal citizens historically. Second, my book will be moving sequentially, telling a story of the long 20th century. So the first chapter begins in the late 19th century in Oklahoma, or what was to become Oklahoma, looking at the enforcement of private property upon tribal communities and how this created a profit motive in killing Native women and girls for their property. So as the chapters move forward in time from the late 19th century, I offer a close look at each woman or girl's tribal history to make direct historical links between actions taken against tribes and the gendered violence against Native women and girls. So I'm always thinking about how the past informs the present, and I want to make those historical connections clear for my readers.
Terrific. Your chapters are framed around different women's stories, right? Maybe you could share with us a bit more about the women and girls in the book.
Yeah, exactly. My goal is to show the range of Indian country. We know that Indian country is incredibly diverse, and it's not possible to generalize about all Native women or girls. So the book offers 6 case studies of women and girls, but then the book is about far more than just 6 people. And to be clear, the book is not about the pathologized individual. In fact, I don't really talk much about the assailants. So my goal is to bring various regions into play and also various causes into play. So I look at Cherokee Nation, the Plains, Canada, the American Southwest, and Mexico. Not that those are representative of Native America, but I'm trying to create some regional sort of sensitivity. So some of the women include the Cherokee woman who was born at the time of Oklahoma's statehood in 1907, and she was targeted by a US district court judge for her tribal allotment. Another woman is Pamela George, the Saulteaux woman from Saskatchewan, Canada, who was a single mother and had a tattoo that read, "I love mom." She was murdered in 1995 by 2 white male athletes. Looking at the Plains, I tell the stories of 2 lives. The first story is of a girl I call Anonymous, who was assaulted in 2013 near a man camp at Newtown, North Dakota. In telling her story, I give the history of Fort Belknap and the larger history of oil drilling and fracking on the American Plains. Then turning to an urban center on the Plains, I look at Savannah Greywind, who was murdered in 2017 in Fargo, North Dakota. With Savannah, I look at city police negligence and family separation policies, as Savannah was murdered for the abduction of her baby. In the Southwest, I tell the story of Navajo or Dene mother Loyal Sinigini, whose daughter's name is Tiffany. Sinigini was shot point blank by a police officer in 2016. I also plan to look at a case of an Indigenous woman from Mexico or Central or Latin America to think about similarities and differences in the historical causes of Indigenous femicide in the Americas.
Terrific. It sounds like you can't represent everything, but it sounds like you're covering a really broad swath with those case studies to expand out from. And I know that you do in the book expand out to make kind of theoretical interventions around settler colonialism and the carceral state. I think we're a little short on time, but maybe you could briefly tell us a little bit about those interventions.
Yeah, so basically I'm making the argument, which many have made, that the carceral state goes beyond just the physical spaces of incarceration, specifically of prisons. And I'm thinking about how settler colonialism destroys to replace via the carceral state in terms of separating Native parents from their children and in terms of the legal indifference to Native pain and suffering. So I'm looking at the carceral state more broadly as a legal process that confines and separates.
Terrific. Well, I think we've used up our allotment of time, so we'll turn it back over to Christopher.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Black and Dr. Speed. During the presentation, I was just going urgent, urgent, urgent in my head. I think with both of our presenters so far, they're just really making me appreciate the urgency and the necessity of ethnic studies and the importance of the work that's being done on our campus and at the Institute of American Cultures. So I'm really excited. Can't believe we're already halfway through. Our presenters will transition into our third presenter right now. So our next session is Southside, We Outside, Why the Lives and Deaths of Clifford Glover and Sean Bell in Jamaica, Queens Matter, with Debanjan, Roychoudhury, PhD candidate in sociology at UCLA, interviewed by Dr. Marcus Hunter, chair of the African American Studies Department at UCLA.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I appreciate it. And I was the inaugural chair. Cheryl Keys is the chair now at African American Studies. Peace, everyone. Thank you for the IAC for this opportunity and to come together. And shout out to all of the people in the digital audience. We really appreciate you all being here. Without any further delay, because we have a short amount of time, Debanjan, we met many years ago now, and you didn't necessarily intend on studying what you wound up studying. And so I've always found the origin of your story as connected to the origin around your research. So if you just want to share a little bit about how you came upon this project.
Yeah, absolutely. Peace, Marcus. Peace to everybody who's here. It's just amazing to be here with the IAC, and thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be representing the Bunche Center for African American Studies today. And absolutely, Marcus, I think back to when we first met, the first few times we met, my first year at UCLA, just as a wee student, PhD student in sociology at the time. And I came from all across the country, from New York City, from Queens. And when I moved out to California, I definitely didn't think that my dissertation project would bring me back home, but it ended up being that way because of the stories and the lives and deaths of two spirits. And I think what's kind of beautiful about this whole forum, I've seen a lot of connections between the talk so far, but just thinking about murdered and missing people. The two souls, 10-year-old Clifford Glover and 23-year-old Sean Bell, were both gunned down by police, plainclothes police officers in Jamaica, Queens, in the same NYPD precinct, in the 103rd precinct. And when I stumbled upon that story of what happened to Clifford Glover in 1973, and having already known from growing up in Queens what happened to Sean Bell in 2006. And seeing this pattern, this connection between their two stories, and the fact that, when we think about history, when we think about collective memory, the fact that I had never, learned the story of, of Clifford Glover prior to, beginning graduate school and thinking about issues around policing, because of my own upbringing, excuse me, and thinking about the origins of the stop and frisk policy and broken windows policing, and the kind of policies that made New York City's development as a city really notorious. Those hyper aggressive policing policies instituted by the New York Police Department, in my youth, were directly related to the legacy of police power and Black power, and how those two are related throughout the history of not just New York City, but urban America more broadly, following in 1968, two really important bills. One, the Kerner Commission two very important reports. The Kerner Commission report on civil disorders, which tried to capture why American cities rebelled, Black communities in American cities rebelled throughout the 1960s, especially in response to police violence and the maintenance of segregation and white power. So, thinking about that, and alongside the omnibus crime bill of the 1960s, and just overarching increase in police power, specifically due to the war on drugs tactics that those actually originated in Jamaica, Queens as well, it kind of led to me constructing my dissertation as this historic timeline that takes us from 1973 with the tragedy of 10-year-old Clifford Glover, where officers were acquitted of all charges, all the way through to 2006, where the murder of Sean Bell in that same neighborhood had similar results. The plainclothes officers who were tried were all acquitted of all charges, and actually there were Black officers present at the time as well. So that's really the origin and kind of also the backbone of the project, is to think about Black agency, Black politics, press, and actually thinking about collective power and collective action in the wake of and in response to police violence and police power.
And in the last couple of minutes that we have, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to reflect back the summer of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. As this was happening, of course, the whole world is attending to this in some way. But I immediately thought about the work that you were doing. And one great thing about the IAC and also the Bunche Center is its ability to support work like the work that you're doing, and doing it even when everyone isn't paying attention in the way that we are globally attending to. But having that line up felt so serendipitous in ways that I think are very important and timely. And if you could just say a little bit about how you see this moment reflecting, or what comes up for you when you see that happening globally around your research.
Yeah, Marcus, I have to say, I really I walk in your footsteps, because, I just think about the Black planet. I think about chocolate cities, and I think about this global rebellion, and it's an ongoing rebellion. That's how I think about it. I'm really interested in the colonial origins of American policing, and to think about race, to think about Blackness, to think about resilience, rebellion, politics, culture, all from this perspective of, well, what if we centered Black lives? What if we centered Black communities? What if we centered the histories of the land, right? Just real quick, Jamaica, Queens is named after the Yamaiko Indians of the Algonquin people, right? It's a tribe, and that's different from the origin of the country Jamaica, which is also named after the Arawak people of that land. And to think about, well, these are places where you have white settlers, and then you have colonial Black peoples and Black diasporic peoples of the world gathering, and you have this global rebellion that's ongoing from colonialism. You can draw a direct line up to our current moment, and so that's really the basis of my research and my thinking, and to think about it as connected, right? It's a global struggle. It's the global idea of race, of whiteness, and the global idea of indigeneity, Blackness, and the other, and the subaltern, and how we think about that conversation and that dialogue. But it is also war in a sense, and that's what we see too when I study rebellion, urban rebellion, in following police violence. I think it's important to think about the long struggle and that connection and that community, and yeah, just thinking with the whole center, and thinking with all the different ethnic studies centers here has just been amazing, and I'm glad to be here. This feels really empowering to be able to share my work in this way. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I also appreciate, I love music. So I hear in it a Bob Marley reference, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior. Well, everywhere there is war. Shout out to Haile Selassie and the great country of Ethiopia. I appreciate you, Debanjan. I'm so very proud of the work that you have been doing. And folks, in the Q&A, I would encourage you to ask him about his techniques. I mean, this brother is using all sorts of geographic ways of mapping these things, census data, archival data. It's just a very rich, beautiful project. Thank you so much, Debanjan. I want to pass it back to our wonderful host and MC for today, Christopher, who will take it from here. Peace, everybody.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And Debanjan, wonderful to hear you too. When you started off and you were saying that you were starting to draw the different threads from the different presenters, and then we got to hear your presentation. I was just like, oh my goodness, is it the Q&A yet? To see all of these different scholars thinking, about different geographies and different modalities, addressing such important issues. I'm excited to hear how we all get to come in conversation about, as you mentioned, the rebellion against state-sanctioned violence as it's appeared not only in the present day, but over generations. So thank you for helping us make those lines visible and to rebel alongside you. We're up right now for our final presentation, and our final session is called Stewards of the Land, Race, Space, and Environmental Justice, with Dr. Stevie Ruiz, Associate Professor of Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge, interviewed by Dr. Lara E. Gómez, Professor of Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. I'd also like to give a reminder that after this interview, there will be a Q&A with our presenters from this event. If you have any questions you'd like to ask them, then please do so on your screen. And welcome to our final presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Christopher. And I think that as you have said, we're going to hear a lot of additional resonancies in this next segment as well. I'm very happy, Stevie, to be talking with you this afternoon about your book in progress, Stewards of the Land, Race, Space, and Environmental Justice, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina. Congratulations for that. Your project breaks new ground by taking what we commonly assume is a relatively recent environmental justice movement and showing how, in fact, it is more deeply rooted. Can you explain?
Yeah, first I want to thank the IAC as well, like everyone else, and I'm really excited to be here. And thank you, Laura, for the amazing feedback that I think we're going to have today. One of the things that I noticed in the literature, but also in my community work since I became a professor at CSUN, was that there were environmental justice orgs that were interested in trying to track what were the history of immigrants prior to 1960s and the relationship to the environmental movement. So this came out of some of the work that I had done with environmental educators in the K through 12, actually, with one of my colleagues. And so what I came across in revisiting this history is that there was a long history dating back from since the origins actually of the environmental movement, of immigrants and their relationship, building their relationship with the environment, and especially with Asian American communities and Chicano Latino communities. So this is something that I wanted to take up, especially one of the reasons why is that the mainstream environmental movement, much like Jane had identified in the literature on churches, was predominantly dominated by whiteness. And I saw that this was a barrier, especially for immigrant communities, when we're trying to trace traditional, what they call in environmental justice circles, tech or traditional ecological knowledge, is what are the roots of our techniques and skill sets that we bring from our home countries to the nation, what skill sets and assets. And I think this is fundamentally important, especially as immigrant communities are in the front lines of climate change. So this was a historical question. I said, so what would it mean if we stretched back that timeline prior to what we formally conceive of as environmental justice of the 1960s, which we kind of traditionally see or house being birthed out of the civil rights movements, especially out of Afton and Dixie in North Carolina.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I think actually is a good segue to this next question, which is really pointing out to the audience that one of the real contributions of your book is you are bringing together these histories of California's diverse communities, and specifically Chicano, American Indian, and Asian American communities. And I guess if you could just kind of continue that thought, why is it so important to put those histories of those groups, and specifically immigrants and people of color, into conversation with California's environmental history?
It's a beautiful question. Well, in the research, what I found is that there is a long history of nativism in the environmental movement. And that one of the things that I've been thinking through as a framework and borrowing from the work of environmental sociologists about nativist environmentalism is that when you look at the lives of men like John Muir or even Stephen Mather, who was the first National Park Service director, many of these men actually hired Chinese workers to help build the National Park Service, launder in the buildings, help upkeep the hotels. And one of the things that what we very often do is conceive of environmentalism as something that is a place of leisure, a place where we go to visit, that's removed from immigrant communities. But when you actually look at the lives of immigrants, the people that are doing the work of environmentalism, very often don't call themselves environmentalists. And this was a profound question for me, especially when I found that the work being done by the Chinese in John Muir's estate, or if I looked at the lives of the Chinese in Yosemite. But also what was something that I grapple with in the book are also Chicanos and farm worker communities, Chicanos working in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. We very often don't know about this long history of Chicanos in New Mexico, some of the work that's been done, by some historians, but we don't really frame it as an environmental issue. We kind of relegate it as labor history. And so my job, I think, that I want to do, what I'm doing in this book, is being able to converge those lessons that we have that kind of are disjointed and see what contribution do they make for the environmental movement. And then that can teach environmentalists, well, all of these things about diversity and inclusion really aren't new. And if we were to revisit the earlier part of the 20th century, might have had a more democratic and a more robust conversation about what environmentalism could have been, especially in the mainstream movement.
I love that about your project, and I know we're running short of time, but I do want to come to just one more question that maybe we can proceed with briefly, and it really is motivated by a quote that you have in your fourth chapter. You say that it's crucial to understand, quote, how cultural nationalism was a means to combat white supremacist policies that were responsible for land appropriation, settler colonialism, and capitalism. And in just the couple of minutes that we have left, I was wondering if you could discuss how the National Land for People organization tried to accomplish that, or how your story of it accomplishes that.
Yeah, so this is a widely undocumented organization that historians are barely kind of delving into the archives out of Fresno. It was a group called the National Land for People, which was a kind of off branch from the UFW movement. And to make a long story short, they were actually an organization that tried to use an affidavit or a clause in the 1902 reclamation law to reclaim land. But much of the iconography and imagery that they used was borrowing from Chicano nationalists like Tijerina or even using terms from the Mexican Revolution about that those that work the land, or the land belongs to those that work it. And I thought that was profound because I think one of the things that we very often do when we revisit cultural nationalism, we see that there's either people to kind of just detach from it or don't want anything to do with it or critique it or write it off. But I actually want to revisit this and say, well, what do these claims mean? But what does actually cultural nationalism do for environmental justice activists, especially when they're trying to make larger claims about petitioning corporations that have amassed huge amounts of acreage and use those 40 acres to try to downsize massive industrial agriculture in the valley. So that's one of the hopes that in revisiting that kind of turn out of that chapter. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your work. I look forward to reading the book, and I will turn it back over to you, Chris.
I think this is the fastest that any event has ever gone in the history of UCLA. Thank you so much to all of our presenters, and Dr. Ruiz. I'm going to be sitting with the Waugh for this idea of reframing the Chicano movement as not only a site of labor struggles, but of environmental justice and gains. And I'm really excited now to transition from our presenters into the Q&A portion of our event. I see that we do have some messages in the chat, so we'll have all of our presenters join us back. And then the first question that I want to read for everyone in the Q&A, it comes from Gabriel Reyes. And the question says, I was wondering if Professor Black could elaborate on how environmental injustices, such as pipelines, directly impact the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
Absolutely, thank you. And hi, Gabe. Gabe was my student at UC Santa Barbara and now a graduate. And it's really great that he's here. So thank you for that question, Gabe, and thanks for joining us. So this chapter that I was talking about who I'm calling Anonymous, this 4-year-old girl who was found assaulted, is the chapter where I look at these environmental injustices and the impact of pipelines, either the building of pipelines or the functioning of pipelines in Indian country impacts girls and Native women and Native Two-Spirits. So kind of the short answer to that, Gabe, and to everybody listening, is to think about how these projects, these construction projects, require massive numbers of mostly men, almost entirely white men. And these men relocate from their homes, from their families, because this is such a great opportunity to make money that's far higher paying than, say, a service job or even regular construction work. So I may have used the phrase man camps. What these companies do is they build these camps with trailer upon trailer upon trailer, housing these white men who are dislocated from their communities and from their families, who are earning pretty huge amounts of money and working really long hours. So these men come to either rural communities or actually on Indigenous land, on Native reservations. And they come there with the attitude that they are, that they arrive with impunity, that they can get away with really anything, which kind of ties into the name of my book, How to Get Away with Murder. So that's kind of what's happening in these communities, where you have huge numbers of dislocated white men with a lot of money who expect to be able to commit crimes against Native people. And they do commit crimes against Native people in horrifying numbers. And if I didn't make it clear in my presentation, they are very rarely charged. The local police absolutely cooperate with these crimes in that they do not investigate, they do not charge, they do not arrest for the most part when the assailant is a white male. So not only does this do violence to the land, which anybody can see that, this also brings with it just a tsunami of gendered violence against Native women and girls.
Thank you so much for your answer. The next question that I'm going to go to is one of the pre-questions that we had on file. Also, if anyone wants to submit questions live at the event, the Q&A function is at the bottom of their screen, and the questions can be submitted via that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just feel free to type in who the question is for. And I'll move to one of the questions that we have on file right now for Dr. Jane Hong. And the question is, what about your research do you think is most resonant or important in our current moment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I framed that question in particular because I think I alluded to some of this earlier, but you know, I really started writing this project to explain the phenomenon of Asian American Trump voters beginning in 2017. And I think, you know, amid the pandemic and talk about anti-Asian violence, and I've recently seen polls that show that white evangelicals are the least likely of any polled group to believe that anti-Asian violence is a problem in America, something like 35% versus 91% of Asian Americans. So, I mean, I think, you know, I think in this moment, it's important because of where we are politically, but I think that Asian Americans are also part of a larger kind of phenomenon and development where you have growing conservatism among kind of non-white groups generally. And we saw this in the 2020 election. I've been reading a lot of coverage of this as time goes on. So the research I'm doing, it is, you know, I am trying to illuminate particularly how kind of Asian Americans and from their distinct racialized position, how kind of they view whiteness, white Christian nationalism. Where do Asian Americans fit into that formulation? How do they imagine themselves as part of that conversation? But in talking about Asian Americans, I'm also trying to illuminate kind of this broader story of just the growth of conservatism among non-white Americans, including immigrants and kind of immigrant children and immigrant communities generally. And I think that history is really important to kind of think about, and the centrality of religion in that history and to understanding why that has happened.
Thank you so much. The next question that I'll read is across the panel. And the question says, thanks for a great panel. Many of you are working on the historical interdisciplinary projects that make us rethink methods and the archive. What is your advice or lessons learned as you work on these projects and historical projects during COVID? What are the difficulties, opportunities doing historical interdisciplinary work in this moment? Are there lessons learned or new lessons that should be carried over in the context of the archives reopening and the IAC's larger mission of advancing research for social justice? And this question comes from Genevieve Carpio, so thank you.
Okay, I could take a quick stab at it. First, hi Genevieve. And that's a great question. I think one of the suggestions that things that I've come across is the generosity of some of the people that I've reached out to because of COVID. And I think I would say is take a chance. And there might be that individual that you have always wanted to reach out to, but were too afraid. And that's what I did. And they actually were able to send me copies of their personal family records. And that I think was because of the constraints, but also they realized the urgency behind certain history that needs to be documented in a way that I think is equitable. I think what we've seen too is that it's the cost of trying to have someone digitize your work or whatever archive you need might not be feasible for a graduate student or an undergraduate right now. So I think the hidden cost that we kind of assume is not always equity centered. So I think that that's something that I would just kind of throw out there.
Yeah, I would say that, doing this important, like you said, with multiple methods, thinking historically, and, wanting to work with people, but being presented with the challenges of the pandemic, it's made us all have to, I think, really rethink how much can be done digitally, virtually, how much can be done, without always being face to face with certain materials and certain, opportunities, especially when it comes to community-based research. So I found that the power of Zoom is really important in connecting people. In some ways, maybe it even makes it more accessible because of certain times and ways that people can meet that don't require travel and commuting and being out till late all the time. And then I think also just what is available to you. So for me, working with newspaper data, a lot of it is available digitally, and you're able to access reports and accounts of things that happened in the past, without having access all the time to physical archives, and it is difficult. Whatever data you can have, I think that's something that's a challenge for all of us. Obviously there are certain things that are digitized and available online, statistical data, census data. Fortunately, in studying New York City, the availability of police misconduct data and stop and frisk data, there is a level of transparency that makes it unique in terms of being able to study in that way. So it's definitely, I think it's for all of us, it's forced us to come up with new ways to continue the work, and get creative about how to continue to stay connected, especially when it comes to, like I said, community-based research, working with civic organizations, community organizations, et cetera.
So in the Q&A, there's also a lot of love and affirmation. So I'm like trying to sift through the love and affirmation alongside the questions, which is nice. So thank you for the kind audience as well. I see a couple more questions here for Dr. Jane Hong, Dr. Ruiz that I want to jump to. I know that we have about 7 or so flexible minutes left in the event, so I'll be attentive to that. And then I also would love to circle back to Debanjan to maybe we could pull together some of those threads, because I'm still so excited about your comment from the early part of the presentation. So that's my strategy as I look at the Q&A. So we'll jump to Dr. Ruiz first. I'm going to tie 2 of these questions together. The first one comes from Angelica Yanez, and it says, Dr. Ruiz, can't wait to read your book. Any thoughts on the ways cultural nationalism gets misunderstood? And then the second question is, for Dr. Ruiz, what is an example of a way in which Chicano self-determination was not reflected in the white-dominated environmentalism of the past?
Well, I think that I can answer both together, so that thank you for the questions. And those are both really excellent questions. I think as a Chicanoist, I teach in a Chicano Studies department, one of the oldest. We're just have our 50th anniversary. And I think it's brought a lot of revisiting of us about, what is cultural nationalism? What work does it do? And is it as simplistically reduced in the way I think that very often we kind of relegate as being hyper patriarchal or hyper racist or anti whatever. And I think that one of the things that we miss sometimes is, what does it do for poor working class people that are in the space of, or at the front lines of environmental catastrophe? And one of those environmental catastrophe was the droughts of the Fresno, in the San Joaquin Valley. There was significant reduction of water access and clean water use. And what that means is, in what way can we actually see or expand the uses of cultural nationalism in the ways that actually worked for communities of color, and that didn't necessarily think about it in the way that I think very often sometimes we might dismiss. And so I think that can be one realm. And the second part of the question I think is really good. If the person had asked about Chicano self-determination, I think we see that in the land reclamation movements of the 1960s and 1970s. There are people who are fighting, if you think of the Tijereñas movement out in New Mexico, for example. And I think that these types of cultural histories remind us of what lessons we can learn, especially as EJ activists today, and what deliverables we can have for poor working class people of color on the front lines of climate change.
And Dr. Hong, I'm gonna give you a two-part question if that's okay as well. The first question comes from Robert Melee, and the question is there hope for our BIPOC communities from Buddhist churches in the US with focus on peace and literacy to counter and disrupt the narratives of violence from far-right Christian fundamentalist, settler colonialist? And then the second question is, what have you found so far about Christian fellowships? And this is from a different person. What have you found so far about Christian fellowships on campus and how they affect Asian American families and college students?
Thank you for both of those questions. So I'll flip the order. I mean, in terms of what I think about kind of campus fellowships, which, you know, even if you're not Christian, if you're at a major university, you might have heard of some of these groups. I'm writing that chapter right now, actually. And one of the arguments I'm making is that, you know, these evangelical fellowships, so InterVarsity, Campus Crusade, now called Cru, in particular, but also Asian American fellowships to a lesser extent. But these larger kind of white evangelical fellowships, they help channel Asian Americans into white evangelicalism and into the cultural politics, the gender politics, and the racial politics of white evangelicalism. And one thing I can say, you know, in some ways, this kind of participation can foster and exacerbate pre-existing anti-Blackness within Asian American communities. In terms of gender politics, this has been a big kind of focus for a lot of folks who study evangelicalism nowadays, thinking about patriarchy, misogyny, and sexual violence within the church and within religious communities. So, I mean, I think for Asian American evangelicals who are funneled into these groups, I mean, you know, these groups, some of these groups are still asking questions, or not necessarily these groups, but evangelical organizations, white evangelicals today, some of them are still debating things like, should women be ordained? Can women preach in the church? So there's a particular, right, there's a particular gender politics. And then in terms of kind of misogyny, sexual violence, and abuse within the church, I mean, I can think of examples even recently where you have Korean immigrant churches in the Chicago area. There's a whole Instagram account devoted to a church network. It's called Letters from Rahab is the Instagram post. And it really talks about how, you know, the narrative of sexual violence within kind of white evangelical and white Christian spaces, how does that actually look in Asian American communities? Because there actually is some connection. So folks are trying to kind of tease that out. So, I mean, I think that's kind of two examples of how kind of participation in evangelical parachurch groups on campus during college can be very formative for Asian American Christians really into their adulthoods. And in terms of what, you know, Buddhist and really non-evangelical, I would also say, just folks who are not kind of other religious minded folks within BIPOC communities, I think there's a lot of potential, right, for this kind of far right Christian nationalism to be countered. And I think mainline Christian folks are doing this work. There's a long history of liberal Protestant activism within Asian American communities, as well as American communities more generally. So I am focusing on evangelicals, but right, there is a much broader kind of religious spectrum. The last thing I'll say is the challenge, however, is that far right Christian, kind of white Christian nationalists have an incredible amount of political power right now, and they have a lot of allies in Washington, and that's what makes this story and what makes this problem so difficult to dislodge, right? And so so this knowing kind of this history of how the religious right and the Christian right became so powerful in the United States, I think is important to understanding how these relationships can be undone and how, right, there is possibility, or there is the possibility of transformation in the future. And for religious folks to, you know, come back to their senses in some ways. So I'll stop there.
And as we approach the end of the event, I'm hoping I can field the last question to Debanjan. I was wondering if you could kind of help us pull the threads together, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about interracial, interethnic solidarity, the work that we're doing here across, you know, histories, geographical spaces, and disciplines, and how you also see that reflected or intersecting with your work.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to speak about that for a minute to close us out. First, I just want to say, you know, it's been a pleasure presenting with my co-panelists. It's been, you know, amazing to learn about your phenomenal, important work. And yeah, I'll try my you know, to expand on what I was saying earlier, that I just feel there were so many commonalities that I found across the presentations that I think really speak to the importance of, you know, thinking about power and politics and, you know, the idea of progress, right? Racial progress, and kind of, you know, wrestling with some of these contentions and contradictions. You know, we talked about, you know, I think some, you know, related to my work is kind of support for police power, even from, you know, communities that are disproportionately impacted by police violence, police misconduct, you know, and just kind of the complicated relationship there. Even thinking about New York City's just recently elected mayor, who's from Queens, who was a child there in 1973 during the uprisings following the murder of Clifford Glover, went on to become a police officer and formed a group called 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care, and is now the mayor of New York City, and has alienated a lot of the more progressive and you know, more radical or just, you know, who want to push back against police power. And he, among many other in leadership, stand as these people who represent communities of color, but their politics are contentious, right? In terms of, you know, what are the types of kind of ways that we can think about progress and think about also, you know, faces in high places. But I don't know, just the kind of contentious politics of it, I think, is something that I saw in all the presentations. And yeah, I definitely support, you know, I think studying of interethnic studies, right, alongside learning histories alongside one another, and finding the sort of collaborations and contradictions and contentions within those movements, right? You know, and again, in my field site, that's really important. It's a community that's over half, you know, it's a majority Black community that also is almost half foreign born, right? Queens County, New York is one of the most diverse counties in the world, linguistically, ethnically, religiously. So when I talk about Blackness, when I talk about a kind of third world kind of movements and rebellions, I really do think across sort of ethnic studies and across Black studies traditions, as well as other intellectual traditions. So again, I'm just thankful to be here and sharing with you all. And yeah, I wish you all the best in all your work. And I'm really glad we got to share space today. It's been amazing, and I've gained a wealth of knowledge from it. So thank you all.
And thank you to all of the presenters. This concludes the Fall Forum on behalf of UCLA's Institute of American Cultures. Thank you to all of our featured speakers, interviewers, the UCLA Development Events Team, American Indian Studies Center, Asian American Studies Center, Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, Chicano Studies Research Center. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, UCLA Alumni Diversity Programs and Initiatives, UCLA American Indian Studies Interdepartmental Program, the Department of Asian American Studies, Department of African American Studies, Cesar E. Chavez, Department of Chicano and Central American Studies, and the Department of Gender Studies. For everyone in the audience, please take a moment to fill out the survey on your Zoom screen. If you'd like more info about ways to support the scholarship being conducted at the Institute of American Cultures, then please consider checking out the How to Give page on our website. And thank you everyone again for joining us this afternoon and for making these spaces possible. Have a good rest of your week. Bye.